In this lesson, we're going to learn about a zero product property, what that means. Zero product property is pretty simple. It basically says if two numbers are multiplied together and they equal 0, then one of them must be 0. So quite simply put, the zero product property just basically says that if I have two numbers, and it doesn't matter what they are, but let's call them A and B, and I multiply them together and they are equal to 0, then A is equal to 0 or B is equal to 0. Because the only way we can have two factors whose product is 0 is if one of the factors is already 0. The only way we get 0 when we multiply is we've multiplied by 0. So since we've learned what ands and ors mean in the context of solving equations, now we can solve some of the equations that we couldn't solve before. So let's look at this. So I have a quantity, x minus 1. Now that's a factor. Factor is any number being multiplied. An x minus 2 quantity, that is another factor. And the quantity x minus 3, another factor. And they're all multiplied together to equal 0. So to find the solution set for this equation, or numbers that might work for this equation, either x minus 1 has to be 0, or x minus 2 has to be 0, or x minus 3 is equal to 0. Now, I have a bunch of these little equations broke up, and I know that in order for it to equal 0, the first, the second, or the third factor have to be 0. So I can solve this little mini equation right here by adding 1 to both sides, and I will get x is equal to 1. I can solve this equation here by adding 2 to both sides, and I will get x is equal to 2. And then over here I can add 3 to both sides, and I'll get x is equal to 3. So my solution set looks like x such that x is equal to 2, 3, or 1. So x has to be one of those numbers. Now notice what would happen. If I plugged 1 in, I would get this factor being 0, this factor being negative 1, and I would get this factor being negative 2. And 0 times 1 times negative 2 is 0. Same story if I picked a 2. 2 minus 1 is 1. 2 minus 2 is 0. 2 minus 3 is negative 1. Anything times 0 is going to end up being 0, so you're good. And with 3, this factor will end up being 0, and 0 times whatever other two numbers will give us 0. Now, something like this, we've just been looking at and trying to find the number that would give us 0. And that's pretty difficult. So what happens is we can use factoring, which is the reverse of the distributive property, to make it look like we have two factors multiplied to give us 0. If we know the zero product property, we can kind of rearrange some equations we couldn't solve before into something we can solve. So mainly, I'm going to look at these two terms in this binomial, and I'm going to factor out an x, because they both share an x. If I take x squared and divide it by x, I will get x. And if I take 2x and divide it by x, I'm going to get 1. Oh, I'm sorry, 1 times 2, which will give me 2. And that's a positive 2. I'm going to put a plus. Now I've got a number, x, and a number, x plus 2, multiplied together that give me 0. Well, that just means that either x is equal to 0 or x plus 2 is equal to 0. And this is already equal, but we can subtract the 2 on both sides, and we'll get x is equal to negative 2. So the solution set is either x is equal to 0 or x is equal to negative 2. And furthermore, we can even check that. And we'll see that 0 squared is 0, and 0 plus 0 is 0. 2 times 0 will give us 0 as well. If we plug negative 2 in, it's a little more interesting. Negative 2 squared is 4, and 2 times negative 2 is negative 4, and negative 4 plus 4 is equal to 0 as well. So both of our solutions work, and we are able to do it in just a couple steps. All right, last one. Once in a while, you'll end up with an equation that isn't so obvious that we can solve it using the zero product property. Now, a lot of people's inclination is to do this. Well, I want to get p's on one side, numbers on the other, so let's get rid of that p. P divided by p is just 3, and p squared divided by p is p. But what if p was 0? We can't divide by a 0, so in that instance it wouldn't work. So maybe we're leaving out a solution. And if you notice, if I put in 0, 0 squared is 0, and 3 times 0 is also 0. So 0 is a solution, but we've just lost that solution by solving it that way. So let's use our new trick called the zero product property, and let's subtract 3p on both sides instead of dividing. That leaves me with p squared minus 3p on this side, and then 3p minus 3p is 0. Now I can factor out the p, and now I have two numbers, two factors, multiplying together that give me a product of 0. So that means either p is 0, or p minus 3 is 0, and p is equal to positive 3. So by not dividing, we end up losing a solution. And now with our zero product property, we get all the possible solutions to the equation. In fact, in any instance where you have a p squared, most of the time what you should do is factor and get it equal to 0, and you use the zero product property. It's going to be a handy tool in our toolkit for solving equations.